This is The Cluttered Path, stories about life and the human experience. My name is Todd, and I'm here with James.
Good morning, sir. How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling great, brother. Hope you are too.
I am. Thank you. We appreciate our listeners and want to invite you to connect with us. You can find links to our website and socials in the description of this episode. Additionally, you may email feedback@clutterpath.com with any feedback or questions.
So the last episode was a story of love and devotion. Temujin's wife Borte was abducted, and we also got some insight into Temujin's religious beliefs, where he entered into 3 days of prayer and worship. And there was a story called The Tale of Three Rivers in the book, where the earth and sky is one of their objects of worship. Well, earth and sky being two objects of worship. And those helped Temujin decide that he did indeed want to rescue Borte with the help of Ong Khan and his friend Jamuka. So new life emerged for Temujin's clan as they merged with Jamuka's. So today the story continues as Temujin, aka Genghis Khan. Temujin will become leader of his own clan, but then we'll see rivalries emerge between Jamuka and Temujin, and they end up parting ways. And then Temujin becomes Temujin Khan in his own right. And he implements a radical new power structure in his new clan, something that's never been seen before in the history of mankind. So we'll start with an excerpt from the book. It's entitled Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World, written by Jack Weatherford. It provides highlights of this lifelong conflict that emerges between Temujin and his childhood blood brother, or Anda, Jamuka. So that's the excerpt I'm going to read. The rift between the two young men on that early summer night in the year 1181 evolved into 2 decades of warfare as Temujin and Jamuka both rose in stature as leading Mongol warriors and hardened into the bitterest of enemies. After his split with Jamuka at the age of 19, Temujin seems to have determined to become a warrior leader of his own, to attract his own followers and build a base of power, eventually aiming to become a Khan, the leader and unifier of the unruly Mongol tribe. In that pursuit, his chief rival would be Jamuka, and their feud would gradually engulf all the Mongols in a civil war. The two rivals spent the next quarter of a century stealing animals and women from each other, raiding and killing each other's followers, and struggling to see which one would eventually rule all the Mongols. So this sets the tone for today's episode: rivalry and conflict.
Lots of both. So much to cover.
So as you're listening, try to immerse yourself in this story. Not long after these two clans settled into their new lives, rivalries emerged. The book introduces us to the caste system of Mongol society, and they believed in a kinship hierarchy which emphasized lineage or ancestry. So lineage, they just simply summed it up as either a white bone or a black bone. A white bone lineage, those were your close kinsmen. Black bone lineage were distant kin. And these lineages between Jamuka and Temujin, they actually traced their lineage back to one important ancestor. It was a single woman with 2 different husbands. Jamuka descended from the first husband, who was a herdsman, and Temujin descended from a second husband of that same woman. He was a hunter who killed the first husband and captured the wife. So, according to Mongol tradition, Jamuka could claim higher lineage because he descended from the firstborn son of the first husband. So here we have an ancient, uncivilized people who've created this sort of pecking order in society that's handed down through the generations, where people say, hey, I'm better than you because my grandpa was firstborn of his family.
Yeah, the birthright tradition went on and still goes on today in some countries. You know, we had to literally have a tea party to get away from it.
Exactly. But with the Mongols, your birthright, it gave you privileges. And that was the state of affairs in ancient Mongolia. This caste system didn't sit well with Temujin. He seems to have been the lone person who questioned the way things are and said, this just ain't right. And being unhappy with the situation, the relationship with Jamuka sours. So after the clans merged, Temujin, he goes with the flow for about 18 months, learning from Jamuka. If you remember from last episode, Temujin actually had to move from being a hunter in the mountains to a shepherd on the steppe or the plains. He spends about 18 months learning this new way of living from Jamuka, but as long as Temujin was part of Jamuka's clan, he would rank as a lower black bone in their caste system. In this part of the book, Jamuka begins treating Temujin, Genghis Khan, less than a ceremonial brother or Anda that we learned in previous episodes. He starts treating him less like a brother and more like a little brother. So here's a quick excerpt from the book. Temujin was not one to accept being treated as an inferior for long, and soon enough this situation proved unacceptable to him. End of quote. So the tide breaks in the year 1181. At this point, Temujin is 19 years old, and Jamuka orders the clan to break winter camp and move to summer pastures. Temujin and Jamuka, they're riding at the head of this train of followers, but Jamuka decides at that moment he is no longer willing to share leadership. And then he issues an order telling Temujin to carve off the inferior livestock and take his people to camp separately. So this was a slap in the face. Jamuka was treating Temujin as an inferior. Here's an excerpt from the book. According to the secret history, when Temujin received the order, he dropped back where his own family and animals were traveling in the rear of the train, and he consulted with Holun. Holun is his mother, by the way. He seemed confused and unsure how to respond. Upon overhearing Temujin describe the situation to his mother, however, Borte, that's his wife, Borte interrupted and insisted angrily that her husband break with Jamuka and that they, and whoever wished to follow them, set out on their own. Later in the day, when Jamuka stopped to pitch camp and rest for the night, Temujin and his small entourage fled in secret and continued moving throughout the night in order to put as much distance as possible between them and Jamuka in case he decided to pursue them. Either by plan or spontaneous choice, many of Jamuka's followers fled with Temujin, taking, of course, their animals. Despite this fission in the band, Jamuka did not pursue them. The rift between the two young men on that early summer night in 1181 evolved into 2 decades of warfare, as Temujin and Jamuka both rose in stature as leading Mongol warriors and hardened into the bitterest of enemies. So here we see the actions that result from a belief in their traditional caste system. That system determined a person's position in the hierarchy of Mongol society. And Jamuka used that invented social construct to treat Temujin poorly, and it didn't sit well. It violated Temujin's sense of right and wrong. And it's interesting to note that Temujin consulted with his wife and mother. I like that he valued their views and sought their guidance because that was not the norm for their society.
Yeah, that was huge. First, going to seek his mother's input. And Borte, well, she sounds like a little spitfire. She's tough. Yeah. Don't disrespect my husband. Let's get away from this dude. Secondly, Temujin listening to his wife's input.
Agreed. Definitely not the norm, though. Temujin, he was a different egg.
Yeah. And this is one of the moments where we continue to see Temujin's growth into the leader he is becoming.
Right. Temujin breaks off from Jamuka's clan and sets off on a quest to carve out his own place in the world. And then the book takes us to another segment where Temujin becomes a Khan in his own right. Here's an excerpt from the book. After his split with Jamuka at the age of 19, Temujin seems to have determined to become a warrior leader of his own, to attract his own followers and build a base of power, eventually aiming to become a Khan, the leader and unifier of the unruly Mongol tribe. In that pursuit, his chief rival would be Jamuka, and their feud would gradually engulf all the Mongols in a civil war. The two rivals spent the next quarter of a century stealing animals and women from each other, raiding and killing each other's followers, and struggling to see which one would eventually rule all the Mongols. In the summer of 1189, the year of the cock, and 8 years after his break from Jamuka, 27-year-old Temujin decided to make a play for the title of Khan, the chief of the Mongols, with the hope that once he claimed the title, he would attract more of Jamuka's followers and make the claim into a self-fulfilling prophecy. If not, the claim might at least provoke a final struggle between the two and lead to a more definitive solution to the rival claims. End of quote. So there was a calling of the council. there was a summoning of family and followers to this steppe beside the Blue Lake at the foot of this place called the Heart-Shaped Mountain. Temujin had called this Kuriltai, if you remember from last episodes. A traditional council or Kuriltai was held, and a voting process ensued, and so showing up was simply an endorsement of Temujin as Khan, and not appearing was a vote against. And the only thing Temujin had to do was gain a quorum, and that was a victory. So Temujin was voted in as Khan of his own clan, but this was a minor clan compared to the others in Mongol society. And this could have been viewed as a challenge to his mentor, Ong Khan, his mentor and protector. So Temujin ends up sending an envoy to Ong Khan, where he reasserted his loyalty and asked for Ong Khan's blessing on his leadership, because he was still a vassal. His new office, he wanted to make sure that Ong Khan realized this new office was not a challenge to him, and the goal was simply just to unite scattered clans. But then Ong Khan gets political. He accepts Temujin as the Khan of this smaller clan, and he did it because he wanted to keep subservient Mongols divided and fighting each other. So what he did was he played Temujin and Jamuka off of each other. He encouraged their ambitions to play them against one another because, again, his goal was to keep them weak and under his control. In this part of the book, Temujin wins an election at this Kuriltai, or council. He's 27 years old, he's had success in battle, and has experience as a leader of people, so he's garnered a following. But now he's caught up in Ong Khan's political gamesmanship.
Yeah, politics is apparently really old. A natural process for those who wish to remain in power and keep control. But now we see Temujin caught up in it. While unfortunate, we get to see how he deals with it.
Yeah, there's an ancient saying that says there's no new thing under the sun. These power struggles and politicking have been prominent since the beginning of time. But now as Temujin Khan, we can call him that now, as Temujin Khan, he has the authority and backing to lead his small clan. And he then sets out to build a radical new power structure. And we're going to go through these new policies. These were ingenious policies, never before heard of in human history. These were ideas that originated with Temujin Khan. So we'll go through these, and we'll start with an excerpt here. Having received the support he deemed sufficient to function as the Khan of a minor group, Temujin began a radical process of erecting a novel power structure within his tribe, calling on the lessons of his youth for guidance. A chief's complex of gurs, those are tents, or sometimes we call them yurts, but a chief's complex of gurs that served as his tribal center of his chiefly court was called an ordu, or horde. In most steppe tribes, the Khan's ordu consisted of his relatives and served as a sort of aristocracy over the tribe, managing it and leading it. Temujin, however, assigned some dozen responsibilities to various followers according to the ability and loyalty of the individual without regard to kinship. This was brand new, never before heard of. And let me start with a caveat. Before we dive into Temujin Khan's governing principles, let me point out that this is not a blanket acceptance of his beliefs or any of his behaviors or activities or actions. So please regard this as simply a discussion of history. The policies enacted by Temujin were put in place in the context of constant strife and internecine warfare. Keep that in mind as we go through these. But first, the very first policy that he put in place was a meritocracy. They were assigned roles based on talents and abilities. And Temujin had a very good ability to assess people and place them in roles that were a good fit for them. And this was unique because nepotism is somewhat the norm for humans. So the first guiding principle that Temujin implemented, this struck at the heart of Mongolian tradition. I can imagine that he didn't like to see these bratty children or bratty adult children of other clan leaders put in key positions just because their dad was the Khan. Temujin Khan viewed nepotism as a scourge, and he was hell-bent on eradicating it.
And he turned a lot of heads when he began doing things differently. Word traveled quickly. Folks were watching, both his own followers and those of other clans, and paying attention to the choices he was making. Giving non-family members key responsibilities was very different,
Right.
and so the change begins.
Yes. In modern society, we still view nepotism with disdain. I mean, when you apply for a job, oftentimes you're filling out an online form on the internet and it's like, do you have any relatives that work here? So we don't want nepotism in modern society. So Genghis Khan's, or Temujin Khan's, his views on the matter have propagated into modern society. So that's the first policy. There was this meritocracy. And the second policy is the natural outworking of a meritocracy. Temujin appointed loyal allies without regard to kinship. So along with skills and abilities, Temujin appointed people who had a track record of being all in on the group's mission. He had various positions that he initially had to assign. So the highest positions were his personal assistants. So these were granted to two people, Borchu and Jelme. So these were loyal followers that had demonstrated persistent loyalty for over 10 years. So his personal assistants were the two folks that were initially assigned based on loyalty. The next highest appointments were actually the cooks. Jack Weatherford actually speculated that maybe there was a fear of being poisoned like Temujin's father had been. And maybe that because his father died from poisoning, that made these men very important in Temujin's organization. He considered cooks as the first line of defense. So those were the next highest appointments. And then next up on the list were archers. These were people that guarded the flocks. So they guarded the herds. That was their food. So the archers were next highest appointments, and they were assigned based on loyalty. And then there were the camp guards. Now, Temujin assigned his brother Kasar as one of these because he had demonstrated loyalty. And then there was his half-brother Belgute, who was assigned as caretaker of the geldings. These were horses that were kept at the ready so that you could just jump out and grab a horse and go off like if you were a messenger and had to get something out to the field. And then there was an appointment of an elite bodyguard of 150 warriors. 80 of them served at night, 70 served during the day. And thinking back to our first episode and where we talked about these mythical Mangudai warriors that Dan Hall introduced us to when I was a young Marine, perhaps this elite bodyguard were these mythical Mangudai. We don't know. I haven't been able to confirm, but maybe that's it. But we have to balance the topic of loyalty here by pointing out that Temujin Khan didn't want blind loyalty. He actually expected people to speak up, and everyone had a voice. So these weren't yes men who blindly followed Temujin Khan.
Yeah. Temujin wanted folks who would help him. Help meaning speaking up, sharing information, giving him assistance. Again, as you said, he did not want yes men.
Yeah, and that makes me think of a misconception about the modern military, especially the Marine Corps. Oftentimes people think that the Marine Corps just wants blind obedience and whatever you're told to do, you go do it. And, you're following orders and stuff. That's not the case at all. And that's not what we were taught as young troopers. We were actually taught to speak up, and we were taught that, hey, you have to come up with a plan. And we were kind of given commander's intent. And that was a really good thing because it was like, look, hey, I'm the commander, but here's what I'm trying to accomplish. And now we were instructed as young Marines to come up with our own plans for our subordinate units for how we were there to carry out the mission or the commander's intent. And what that allowed for us to do is to really just sit down, and when things changed during the middle of a mission, you could make a decision and adjust. As long as you're just seeking to carry out commander's intent, you were going to be in good stead with the commander after all the action. But that was good. But back to Temujin, whenever he called a council, even the lowest person was given a voice. They were expected to understand the mission, and they were expected to speak up. But when a decision was made, they were expected to support it and fall in line in support of the mission. Appointment of loyal allies. This wasn't just for blind loyalty. It was reflective of skills, abilities, and those that actively supported the mission. So that was assigning people based on loyalty was another one of his governing principles. But having organized the clan according to skills, abilities, and their demonstrated track records, the next policy deals with conquered peoples and citizenship. So let's start with a little bit of background on how they used to do things before Temujin Khan. Historically, conquered clans were just simply left to their own devices. The emphasis was just on getting their stuff because they were in this survival mode. They just wanted to get their stuff, leave the people alone, let them go on. But often these people who had been attacked and had their stuff stolen, they'd regroup or, band with a larger group and assault their attackers. So this new policy that Temujin Khan implemented fundamentally altered that cycle of counterattack and attack. They would actually conquer the lands that they occupied. So this was a new practice. And these conquered peoples were actually brought in as members of the tribe in good standing. So they were extended full citizenship rights, an ingenious and novel approach to conquered peoples. Here's an excerpt from the book. Temujin Khan symbolized this by adopting an orphan boy from the Jurchen camp and presented him to Holon, his mom, to raise in her gur, or yurt, not as a slave, but as her son. By having his mother adopt this boy, as he had her previously adopt one each from the defeated Merkid, Taichiud, and Tatar tribes, Temujin was accepting the boys as his younger brothers. Whether these adoptions began for sentimental reasons or for political ones, Temujin displayed a keen appreciation of the symbolic significance and practical benefit of such acts in uniting his followers through this usage of, the book calls it, fictive kinship. In the same way that he took these children into his own family, he accepted the conquered people into his tribe with the possibility that they would share fairly in the future conquests and prosperity of his army. End of quote. So the privileges extended to conquered peoples, that was a first in human history. The intent behind this was to just avoid this endless cycle of attack and counterattacks. And it was successful.
This is brilliant. True leadership, but it goes beyond that. There's obviously politics involved, but at the same time, the humanity of treating people as human beings and not slaves or captured people, giving people their dignity and making them part of the community. It really puts things in perspective now as we've watched Temujin for 20 plus years living his life. And, he's realizing this is not good.
Right.
And his takeaway is, let's do something different. Just wow.
Full citizenship with a voice.
With a voice. Just unreal.
Good stuff. So the next governing principle was treatment of conquered leaders. And this one it's a bit of a longer segment here, and it gets a bit uncomfortable here. So an opportunity would emerge in the year 1195. Temujin is 33 at this point. This group called the Jurchen, they were a larger clan. They had a fear of their rivals, the Tatars. They saw the Tatars as growing too strong, and so what the Jurchen did is they instigated Ong Khan to join an attack on the Tatars. A lot of names, a lot of stuff flying around here. But the Jurchen, they wanted to stir up a fight between Ong Khan and the Tatars. Ong Khan agreed, and he instructed Temujin Khan to prepare for war. This foreign raid would end up boosting Temujin's reputation as a military leader and actually increase his economic power among the Mongols. Not that Temujin had aspirations along that front, but the book just reports this as the end result. So it becomes an inflection point. So the next year, 1196, Ong Khan and Temujin, they kick off a campaign against the Tatars at the instigation of the Jurchen. Here's an excerpt from the book. Their raid, carried out according to the same tactics used in typical steppe raids, but on a larger scale, brought quick and easy success. Temujin was profoundly impressed by the sumptuous booty that warfare could yield. Because of their proximity to the Jurchen kingdom, by the way, that's China, but because of their proximity to the Jurchen kingdom and the more sophisticated manufactured goods of the Chinese empire, the Tatars owned more trade goods than any other tribe on the steppe. Among the goods seized, the secret history mentions the impression made on the Mongols by a cradle embossed with silver and covered by a silken blanket embroidered with golden threads and pearls. Even captured Tatar children wore satin clothes decorated with golden threads. In one case, a young boy wore a gold ring in his nose and one in each ear. The ragged Mongols had never seen such luxurious goods worn by anyone, much less a child. So here we have a brand new frontier. They were no longer just a small clan raiding other clans, stealing supplies and kidnapping wives. Maybe that's, kind of a Mongolian redneck campaign slogan. But they weren't just stealing supplies and kidnapping each other's wives anymore. Not Temujin. Yeah. Going to war, we learn here, going to war with Tatars brings this huge influx of wealth.
Yeah, an impressive amount of wealth.
So this influx of wealth, it wasn't the only thing new. It kicked off a lot of soul searching within Temujin about politics. So after the action, Temujin developed his own assessment of what went on. Here's an excerpt from the book. Temujin saw clearly how the powerful Jurched kingdom used one border tribe to fight another. One year they might ally with the Tatars against the Karaid, but the next year with the Karaid and Mongols against the Tatars. Today's allies could be tomorrow's enemies, as in the case of Jamuka, and a tribe conquered today would have to be conquered again and again in a ceaseless cycle of warfare and feuding. No victory was ever decisive, no peace permanent. This lesson would eventually have a profound effect on the new world Temujin would fashion out of this havoc. But for now, the vicissitudes of this particular war had brought an unprecedented number of goods to his people and had improved his standing among men. In the aftermath of this fight, the book reports that Temujin Khan had to deal with a broken alliance. Prior to the kickoff of this war with Ong Khan going against the Tatars, Temujin had actually called on the Jurchen tribe to help out in the fight. But they already had strained relations between Jurchen and Temujin's clan. The Jurchen lineage, again, were introduced back into this caste system. So this Jurchen lineage outranked Temujin, so they viewed his clan as inferior to theirs. They simply refused to show up. And not only that, instead of just not showing up to support, they decided to raid Temujin's camp instead. So this was an egregious betrayal, and Temujin ends up fighting the Jurchen because of this and defeats them. So after defeating the Jurchen, Temujin calls another council, or Kuriltai, and he puts on a public trial of the Jurchen aristocrats. They are found guilty of failing to fulfill their promises to join Temujin in war, and the sentence was death. So the Jurchen leaders were executed. So this was new. In his after-action assessment, Temujin saw this never-ending fighting going on, and so he implemented a policy that says, hey, if you ally with another clan, you better honor that. He ends up defeating the Jurchen, executing all of their leaders, and this is sending a message. Fulfill your obligations, support your allies. No special treatment for aristocrats, and you will be held accountable. Here's another excerpt from the book. Temujin had rid himself of all the leaders of the Jurchen. The messages were clear to all their related clans on the steppe. To those who followed Temujin faithfully, there would be rewards and good treatment. To those who chose to attack him, he would show no mercy. So future conquests from that point on would end with conquered leaders being killed. So here's our takeaway from this section. I'll point out these were situations visited on Temujin Khan. None of this stuff, he never envisioned that he would be a warrior. That's not what he wanted when he started this out as a teenager. But again, we have situations being visited on him. So the Jurched, they're stirring up a fight. They want Ong Khan to fight the Tatars, and Temujin is called on to fight. But the Jurchen leave them hanging. At this point, it was an eye-opener for Temujin Khan. He's like, look, the status quo, if we keep doing things this way, it's going to be never-ending fighting between us. So Temujin's response in implementing this new policy was to reduce internecine warfare.
Yeah, and here we have, a callback to the loyalty thing again. It shows how much value Temujin puts in loyalty. That meant doing what you're supposed to do or called to do. And it's easy to see how cutting off the leaders of these clans would hinder their ability to strike back.
Likely his relationship with Jamuka informed this policy because he was a blood brother from childhood. For 3 different occasions, we've learned in previous episodes that they declared loyalty to one another, blood brothers. And then Jamuka splits, and there's this huge rift between him and Jamuka. So I'm guessing that the relationship with Jamuka informed this policy. But there's this brutal reality of steppe warfare, and that leads to the execution of enemy leadership and acceptance of the rest as followers. So the next natural progression in policy making is a distribution of resources. Historically, at the end of battle, the enemy fled and looting would commence. But there was a problem with this because the fleeing soldiers would regroup and counterattack. And so the result would just be a simple sort of incomplete victory, as it were. Temujin institutes new policies regarding looting. And he says all looting would wait until after complete victory. And the looting would be carried out in an organized manner. Goods were brought to a central location and distributed. And a soldier's share was allocated to each widow and each orphan. And this would turn out to have a profound impact because it was a radical policy. I mean, Temujin is supporting the poorest people in the tribe. And what this did was it inspired loyalty in his soldiers because they knew if they fell in battle, their families would be taken care of. So this caring for surviving families, that's never before heard of. And Temujin's army, they amassed more goods and animals than ever before. But we have to stop here, and in interest of full disclosure, after this final battle with the Tatars where his policy was introduced, a mass killing was ordered. Temujin calls a Kuriltai with clan leaders, and normally they would kill all the leaders and assimilate all the others, but the Tatars were a clan of thousands, too many to assimilate into their clan. He called a council, and a decision was made by the group to kill all males taller than the linchpin on the wheels of a cart. So we're talking about children here that were slain simply because they couldn't assimilate all of the people. Just in the interest of full disclosure, it was a bloodbath, and not something that my modern mind can comprehend. And this is where, I have to say it, I can't fathom the decision-making process and the absolute mass slaughter that came after. But we do see that Temujin Khan institutes policies to make sure that everyone is taken care of. And some of the elites who had historically gotten the bulk of the looted goods were not happy with this. Here's an excerpt from the book. The radical nature of his reforms angered many of them, and some deserted him to join the forces of Jamuka at this point, further drawing a line between the higher prestige lineages and the common herders. Again, he had shown that rather than relying on the bonds of kinship and tradition, members of his tribe could now look to Temujin for direct support. With this move, he greatly centralized the power of his rule, while at the same time strengthening the commitment of his followers.
We watch now as Temujin begins building his empire. We have seen the initial steps, but with these policies, he's beginning to solidify his leadership role. These folks running back to Jamuka, he's like, well, you going back there now. We'll catch up with you soon enough.
Yeah, they were accustomed to having their position in society and wanted that back. They still had the view that they were important because their dad was important. So this caste system is still there. Moving to the next policy, intermarriage and adoption were not sufficient to achieve the goal of merging two large groups of people. Because if kin groups were allowed to remain intact, the larger group would eventually fragment. So the final reformation was instituted, where Temujin Khan developed a decimal organization for the army. So this new organization, he ended up creating, the basic building block was a squad of 10 men, or the book calls it an arbon. So these were 10 men who were to be brothers who fought together. Nobody was ever to be left behind. So this is another ancient policy that has found its way into the modern mindset, especially in the U.S. military. The eldest man in the squad was the leader, but men could actually choose another leader if they wanted to. So these were small units that elected their own leadership. They couldn't change squads under penalty of death. But where practical, they allowed fathers and sons to be in the same squad. So that was the basic building block, a squad of 10 men. 10 squads comprised a company of 100 men, or a zagun, and the leader was elected to lead the company by the troops. And then 10 companies, they created one battalion of 1,000 men, or a mingan. That leader was also elected. The battalion commanders were elected. 10 battalions That equals a group of 10,000. It was called a group of Tumen. And Temujin personally chose the leader of each Tumen. And then 10 Tumen consisted his entire army of 100,000 soldiers. And it was capped there. It was often lower than that. That is how he organized the army, max of 100,000 soldiers. The tremendous impact of this decimal organization is discussed in this excerpt from the book. By forcing them into new units that no man could desert or change under penalty of death, he broke the power of the old system lineages, clans, tribes, and ethnic identities. At the time of his reorganization, he reportedly had 95 Mingan units of 1,000. But since some of the units were not staffed to capacity, the total number of troops may have been as low as 80,000. The entire Mongol tribe became integrated by means of the army. Under this new system, all members of the tribe, regardless of age or gender, had to perform a certain amount of public service. If they could not serve in the military, they were obliged to give the equivalent of 1 day of work per week for public projects and service to the Khan. So the takeaway here is Temujin Khan is implementing now a total societal restructuring with the army at the center and all other aspects of Mongol life flowing out of that. The emphasis was on small units where the lowest ranking soldier is granted authority and responsibility, and they also elected their leaders. But here's an interesting nugget. Now, America is not organized around the military, thankfully, but the concepts of small unit leadership that Genghis Khan created, they were actually key to Allied victory in World War II. Centralized command and control leadership was literally the downfall of Germany and Japan. Allied troops were actually expected to analyze situations in the middle of the fight and decide the best course of action to accomplish the mission. And this was revolutionary.
Indeed. The thing that struck me was the elections. It's like here we have elections. As these groups come together, they're allowed to elect their leaders. Where we see Temujin coming from, this is just revolutionary. We're going to put 10 men together. We're going to say the oldest is in charge, but y'all can go vote. Y'all can go have a vote. Elect your own leader. Just, okay.
Have fun with that. And it's interesting that doesn't happen in the modern military. In the United States, you just simply go to OCS or whatever school and you come out and you're an officer in an infantry battalion and there's a delineation between people. And so this is rather novel concept here, just having elected leaders. We don't do it in today's military. And just a side note, there was a fellow named Colonel David Hackworth. He was a battalion commander in Vietnam. Another side note, I'm doing a side note to a side note here. But we actually had reading lists when I was in the military where we were encouraged to read certain books to help shape our thinking or help us to learn. And I will say that the Marine Corps was literally one of the most intellectually free organizations I've worked for because they encouraged you to act and do and create. And I really enjoyed that. Now, I didn't like all the deployments and all the beatings my body took, so I had to get out. That was the Marines. And now David Hackworth was an Army colonel in Vietnam. And he wrote a book called About Face that I read at the encouragement of my command when I was in the military. Back to this topic of elected leaders. David Hackworth, they didn't elect leaders, but when he was in Vietnam, he really loved draftees because they didn't pull any punches. You've got a kid coming out, they don't want to be there. They didn't elect to be there. They've been drafted. They show up in your unit. And if you're an officer telling them to do something that's going to get them killed, they're going to go, no, we're not doing that. And so it doesn't happen in the modern military. We're not electing leaders and all that stuff. But I really do like that's what the Mongolians did at the behest of Temujin Khan. And David Hackworth, he inspired me from reading his book About Face, and good stuff there. So those were the policies that he implemented. The book also goes on to layer in the story about the vignettes of this ongoing feud with Jamuka. Moving to another segment here, we hear of this ongoing conflict with Jamuka. Here's an excerpt from the book. Although Temujin's followers prospered, Jamuka refused to recognize his leadership. and increasingly became the rallying figure for the aristocratic clans who did not like the changes Temujin was bringing to their traditional way of life. The struggle that began to shape up between the two Mongol factions portended to be more than just a series of raids for loot and captives. It would be a death struggle between Jamuka and Temujin for leadership of all the Mongols. Just exciting. After they split, and Jamuka is jealous and he's angry and he doesn't like what's going on with Temujin, he ends up committing atrocities. First off, he refuses to acknowledge that Temujin is a Khan of his own group, and he regards him as an upstart from an inferior lineage. So there's that caste system rearing its head again. In the year 1190, there was a killing of one of Jamuka's followers, and he used that killing as an excuse to attack Temujin's clan. And Temujin's clan was actually defeated in that attack. And then to prevent the regrouping of Temujin's forces, Jamuka performs these atrocities recorded in the book. The first thing he did was he cut off the head of a captured leader and tied it to the tail of his own horse. The view of the head by the Mongols, it was the most ritually sacred part of the body. And doing this act, literally in the view of the Mongols, defiled the man's soul. And tying it to the tail of a horse shamed his whole family. So that was an egregious act. And then another atrocity, he boiled 70 young male captives alive in huge cauldrons. And the Mongols believed that this destroyed their souls and completely annihilated them. So these were just two of the atrocities reported in the book, but these cruelties, they horrified the Mongols, who then supported Temujin. So Temujin lost the battle, but he gained public support as people feared Jamuka's cruelty. Temujin's followers slowly left Jamuka and rejoined him. But then in the year 1201, Jamuka makes a play to become the Khan of all Mongols. Jamuka calls this council, or Kuriltai, to confer upon himself the Gur Ka, or Gur Khan. This was chief of all chiefs, or Khan of all Khans. And this was a direct challenge to Ong Khan, so a battle naturally ensued. So Ong Khan and Temujin had superior numbers in this fight, and many of Jamuka's followers, they ended up fleeing in the middle of the night as they were attacked. And Temujin winded up chasing them down and attacking them. And during this melee, or this fracas, Temujin is wounded. He's shot in the neck by an arrow. And here's an excerpt from the book. According to the account in the secret history, late in the day, an arrow pierced Temujin Khan's neck. As darkness fell, the two opposing armies laid down their arms and made camp, close to each other on the same field where they had spent the day fighting. Though this may seem strange, by staying close together during the night, they could more effectively watch each other and prevent a surprise attack. Though Temujin's wound was not deep, he lost consciousness after sunset. Such wounds carried a high risk of infection, or possibly poison had been applied to the arrow. End of excerpt. So Jelme, who is a loyal follower of Temujin Khan and his second in command, he ends up attending to Temujin after he's wounded. And he's bleeding a lot. Jelme ends up swallowing the blood. He's sucking it out of his neck and swallowing it because, again, these are more of their religious beliefs. He wanted to avoid offending the earth. But this is gross. He eventually got full of blood and he couldn't swallow anymore, so he had to start spitting it on the ground. And then during the night, Temujin Khan is thirsty, and so Jelme, wanting to care for him, he's going to go over into the other camp and steal something to drink for Temujin Khan. But how do you do that, right? How do you sneak into the enemy camp? He ends up stripping naked and walking into the enemy camp to get something to drink. So Jelme is actually taking advantage of other beliefs of the Mongolians because they viewed public nakedness as debasement. So if they saw some naked guy walking through their camp, they would actually avert their gaze if they saw him. I guess these guys were prudes, or not prudes, but very modest in presenting themselves. But whatever the case, this was sneaky.
Sneaky. He's like, you can't see me.
So he ends up getting him something to drink and bringing it back and caring for him through the night. And Temujin would actually recover the next morning. So he regains consciousness. Long and short of it is this. Temujin Khan defeats Jamuka. And Jamuka, he is the Taichiud clan. And many of his clan, they fled during the night. And then Temujin sends his warriors to pursue them. And then after the battle, most of the enemy leaders were killed and the rest were brought into the fold. But Jamuka himself was able to escape and the feud would continue. So this episode demonstrates the deep bonds of loyalty Temujin Khan inspired in his followers. I mean, he literally got a guy, this was Jelme on his own, stripping down naked and walking into the enemy camp just to get something to drink for his leader. Yeah. So this episode of this neck wound, it's emblematic of the deep bonds of loyalty that Temujin, he seemed to have the gift of inspiring. The steppe tribes of his time changed sides at the least provocation, and soldiers might desert their leaders. None of Temujin's generals deserted him throughout his 6 decades as a warrior. In turn, Temujin, he never had to punish or harm any one of his generals. So among the great kings and conquerors in human history, this record of fidelity is unique.
I like how this wraps this up with just an amazing view of the loyalty of his people. Even those that ran away came back, and they recognized that Temujin was a better leader, a better choice. Even if for just self-preservation alone, but because of his care.
Right. Great loyalty. Yeah. I mean, they could have just gone to another clan if they didn't like Temujin Khan, but they recognized. I'm guessing that a lot of them were like, you know what? This guy actually cared for us. We're with this guy, Jamuka. We do a raid and he just keeps all the stuff and gives it to his favorite people and we're getting nothing. So they voted with their feet and they would rejoin Temujin Khan's clan. So that concludes today's episode. Now let's just do a recap. So we saw today this rivalry between Jamuka's clan and Temujin's clan, and they ended up splitting apart. Temujin would eventually become a Khan in his own right of his own smaller clan, but then he implemented ingenious, groundbreaking governing principles where the ideas live today, and we would agree with them. Now, of course, we're not going to agree with all of the mass killings and stuff, but we can take the good and leave the bad. The conflict with Jamuka, it's long and bloody, and it's going to continue on into further episodes. But in the next episode, we're going to take a look at Temujin Khan's 100,000-man army. They're going to take the field, and we'll get a deep dive into their strategy and tactics. And then eventually Temujin becomes Genghis Khan, and we're going to see a dramatic end to the feud with Jamuka. So we're glad you joined us. We'll see you next time.
Thank you very much for joining us. Thanks, Todd, and we'll catch you on the next episode.
You're listening to The Cluttered Path. Today's episode was made possible by the writings of Jack Weatherford from his book, Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World. Copyright 2004 by Broadway Books, a division of Penguin Random House. The music for today's episode is used with permission of the Lack family.
I wonder who would be